Some rescues aren't rescues at all. Sometimes a man pays to close one door and never notices the woman he loves has simply walked through it and opened 5 more, quietly, on the other side, using the same set of keys. This is the story of a Denver salesman who thought he understood the difference between saving someone and being managed by them, and what it cost him to learn he'd had that backwards the entire time. I spent 31 years in outside sales, most of it selling industrial equipment to construction firms across the Mountain West. And if there's one skill that job gives you, it's reading a room fast, sensing whether a buyer's hesitation is real or performed, whether a stalled deal needs patience or pressure. I was good at it. Good enough to make a comfortable living. Good enough to put my daughter Melissa through college without loans. Good enough that when my marriage to Diane ended after 26 years, mostly from 2 people just wearing each other down, over decades rather than any single dramatic betrayal, I still had enough put away that retirement wasn't going to be a scramble. Diane and I had built a genuinely good life together for a long time, before it wasn't good anymore. 2 kids' worth of soccer practices and school plays, a house in a decent Denver suburb we'd paid off 11 years early, the kind of marriage that looked, from the outside, like exactly the kind of marriage a man my age was supposed to have. It ended quietly, in the end, over a series of conversations that felt less like a fight and more like 2 people finally admitting out loud what they'd both known for years, that we'd become excellent roommates and nothing more. I don't blame Diane for any of what came after. I want that clear from the start. What happened with Joy wasn't her fault, and it wasn't really even about her, not directly. It was about the particular kind of hollow a man feels at 63 when the 2 things that had organized his entire adult life, a marriage and a career, both quietly wind down within 18 months of each other, leaving him standing in a house too big and too quiet, with nothing much left to prove himself against. Choose a voice that resonates with you at your journey. I kept working 2 more years past 64 because I didn't know who I was without a territory to manage, and when I finally did retire, the quiet nearly undid me faster than the divorce had. I tried the usual retirement prescriptions, golf 3 times a week, a woodworking class at the community college, where I built exactly 1 wobbly bookshelf before losing interest, a book club Melissa signed me up for that I attended exactly twice, sitting quietly through a discussion of a novel I hadn't finished, while a room full of retired teachers debated symbolism I couldn't bring myself to care about, and none of it filled the specific shape of the hole that had opened up in my life. I wasn't depressed, exactly, or at least I never let myself use that word for it. I was just profoundly, uncomfortably unnecessary, for what felt like the first time since I was 22 years old, and just starting out. A buddy from my old sales territory, a guy named Roland who'd retired to Angeles City a few years earlier after his own divorce, a man I'd known since our 20s when we'd both started out selling for the same regional distributor, kept inviting me out for a visit, always talking about the golf, the cost of living, the energy of the place. I flew out mostly out of boredom, expecting a week of golf and cheap beer, and not much else. I ended up staying almost 3 weeks that first trip, and going back 4 more times over the following year, each visit a little longer than the last, until Roland finally said what we'd both been dancing around. "Terrence, you're basically living here already. Just make it official." I want to be honest that I laughed him off the first 3 times he said it. By the 4th, I didn't. I met Joy on my 3rd visit, at one of the bars along Fields Avenue that Roland had taken me to, more out of nostalgia for his own younger years than any real intention of setting me up with anybody. She was 28, worked the floor there, and I want to say plainly, because I think it matters to how the rest of this unfolds, that I understood exactly what kind of place it was, and exactly what her job there involved. She had a way of talking about her work that reminded me of how I used to talk about a job site. This specific, practical pride in getting the logistics right, angsty tourists managed, difficult nights smoothed over without complaint, and I liked that about her immediately. I wasn't naive about the setup. What caught me off guard wasn't the bar. It was her, specifically, the way she talked to me like an actual person rather than a mark, asking real questions about my life back home, remembering small details from one visit to the next that most people wouldn't have bothered holding on to. The name of my daughter, the make of the old pickup truck I'd finally sold the year before, a story about a fishing trip with my late father that I'd only mentioned once, in passing, weeks earlier. Roland warned me, gently, the way a friend does when he's seen 100 versions of the same story play out around him. Just go slow, Terrence. Everybody in there's good at making you feel special. That's the job. I told him this felt different. I believed it too. I still believe parts of it were true, even now, even after everything. There's a version of this story where I could tell you Joy was simply cold and calculating from the very first conversation, performing warmth like a script she'd memorized. And it would make for a cleaner story, easier to walk away from. I don't think that version is entirely honest. I think some of what passed between us in those early conversations was real, or at least as real as anything can be between two people operating from such profoundly different positions of power and need, and that complexity has made it harder, not easier, to fully close the door on what happened, harder still to explain to people back home who want a simple villain and a simple fool, and not the messier truth that sits somewhere between the two. Over the following months, mostly through video calls and messages once I was back in Denver, Joy told me about her life before the bar, a story I have no real way of verifying even now but that felt, at the time, completely genuine. Growing up outside Angeles with a mother who'd struggled after her father left, dropping out of school at 16 to help support two younger siblings, ending up at the bar at 19 because it paid more in a night than most other work paid in a week, and because by then, there weren't a lot of doors left open to her. She cried telling me some of it, real tears as far as I could tell, describing a specific memory of walking her younger brother to school in shoes 2 sizes too small, because there wasn't money for new ones that year, and I remember sitting in my kitchen in Denver, with my chest aching for a woman on the other side of the world, whose whole life had apparently narrowed down to one difficult choice after another. I told Melissa about her around that time, carefully, expecting pushback, and got some, reasonable pushback, the kind a daughter gives a father she loves and worries about, delivered over a phone line with real gentleness, rather than any accusation. Dad, I just want you to be careful. This is a big age gap, and you don't really know her yet. I'm not saying it's not real. I'm saying you've only actually spent a few weeks with her in person, total, across a whole year. I told her she didn't understand the full picture, that Joy's circumstances were different from whatever assumption Melissa was working off of, that I'd been there, I'd seen the bar, I understood the situation better than anyone judging from a distance possibly could. I told myself the same thing more than she ever needed to hear it, rehearsing the argument in my own head late at night, the way I used to rehearse a sales pitch before a difficult client meeting. I flew back out for my 6th visit, with a plan already half formed in my head, the kind of plan a salesman makes when he's convinced himself the deal is already good and he's just working out the terms. I wanted to get Joy out of the bar, not as some grand gesture, though I won't pretend there wasn't some of that mixed in, but because I genuinely believed, and still believe in some complicated way, that nobody should have to make a living the way she'd been making hers, if there was another option available. I talked to the mamasan directly, a sharp, businesslike woman named Baby, who ran the numbers on Joy's outstanding advances and fees, with the same clinical efficiency I'd have expected from a collections department back home, sliding a handwritten ledger across a small desk in her office behind the bar, tapping each line item with a manicured finger as she explained it, occasionally glancing up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read at the time, but that I've since come to interpret as something close to professional curiosity, the look of a woman who'd watched 100 versions of this exact transaction and was simply clocking which category I fell into. $2,400 to clear what Joy owed against advances she'd taken over the previous year, plus a customary send-off contribution to the other girls, another $600. A kind of informal severance Baby explained was standard practice. Expected. Part of how a girl left cleanly without bad blood following her out the door. I paid it without much hesitation, counting out the bills in that small office, while Baby recounted them a second time, with brisk professional courtesy, and I remember standing outside that bar on Fields Avenue, The day Joy walked out for the last time, her bag over her shoulder, a few of the other girls hugging her goodbye at the entrance. One of them crying harder than Joy herself did, another pressing a small gift into her hands, a keychain shaped like a heart, and I felt something close to pride, the specific pride of watching someone cross a finish line you'd helped fund. In a way, it was a graduation, I told myself. I'd paid the fees. She was out, and out, in my mind, was permanent. A door that closes behind you and doesn't reopen. The way I'd have understood leaving any job I'd ever had, complete with a going-away party and a clean final paycheck. I set her up in a decent 2-bedroom apartment in a quieter part of Angeles, paid the first 3 months outright, furnished it with what felt, at the time, like real care rather than transaction, a proper mattress, a working air conditioner, a small television she picked out herself with obvious delight, the kind of delight that read to me, in the moment, as someone finally getting to build a normal life after years of not having one. We spent a whole Saturday at a home goods store, picking out curtains together, arguing cheerfully over colors, Joy insisting a warm yellow would catch the afternoon light better than the pale blue I preferred, eventually compromising on a soft cream that neither of us had originally wanted, but that looked, once hung, better than either option alone. And I remember thinking that afternoon, watching her hold 2 different shades of blue fabric up against the light, laughing at my stubbornness, that this was exactly the kind of ordinary domestic happiness I'd assumed I'd lost my chance at when Diane and I split. We settled into a rhythm over the following months that I'd have described, if you'd asked me then, as the happiest stretch of my life since Melissa was small. I flew back and forth every 6 to 8 weeks, video calls most evenings in between, Joy telling me about her days, her mother's health, her younger sister's schooling, a running narrative of an ordinary domestic life that I never once thought to question the texture of. She'd send me photos from the market, from a coffee shop she liked, from a small garden she'd started on the apartment's narrow balcony, tomatoes and a single scraggly basil plant she was inordinately proud of, and I kept every single one of them in a folder on my phone I labeled, without much self-consciousness at the time, Our Life. The first small thing that didn't sit quite right came about 8 months into the apartment arrangement, and at the time I filed it away the way you file away, a slightly odd line item on an invoice that's otherwise clean. Joy mentioned, almost in passing during a video call, that she'd been talking to an old friend from the bar days, a Korean man named Min Jun, who used to visit Angeles a few times a year and had stayed in touch as, her words, just a friend. He helped me before. I don't want to be rude and ignore him. I remember asking, mildly, what kind of help he'd provided, and she brushed it off lightly. Some small gifts here and there back when she was still working. Nothing serious, and I let it go, because pressing on it felt petty, felt like the kind of jealous, controlling behavior I didn't want to be the man who engaged in, especially toward a woman I'd told myself I was helping build a better life. There were other small things over the following year that I noticed, and, one by one, explained away, the accumulation of which reads so obviously in hindsight that I've had to remind myself, more than once, that hindsight is a different instrument entirely from the one I actually had at the time. Her phone, which she'd started keeping face down on tables in a way she hadn't at the start, a habit I told myself was just normal privacy, nothing sinister, plenty of people keep their phones face down. A pattern to her evenings where she'd disappear into the bedroom for what she called video calling my mother at oddly specific times, always around the same 2 or 3 hours, a schedule so regular I once joked that her mother kept better office hours than I ever had in 31 years of sales. She laughed at that joke. I remember the laugh landing a beat too smooth, too rehearsed, though I didn't let myself sit with that observation for more than a few seconds at the time. There was also, once, a message notification that flashed across her lock screen during one of our calls. A name I didn't recognize, followed by a heart emoji, gone before I could really register it, and Joy, quick as anything, said it was a spam number, blocked it right there on camera to prove the point, a small piece of theater I accepted completely at the time, and have thought about often since. I want to be honest about why I didn't push harder on any of it, because it's the part of this story I've had to sit with the most since. I was 65 years old, divorced, and had spent the 2 years before meeting Joy feeling, for the first time in my adult life, genuinely unnecessary to anyone. Diane had moved on comfortably, remarried within a year, actually, to a retired dentist she'd met through a church group, and while I was genuinely glad for her, the finality of it had landed harder than I expected. Melissa had her own family, her own full life in Portland, calling out of love, but not out of need, weekly calls that were warm and real, but that reminded me, every time, how little day-to-day space I actually occupied in her world anymore. Joy needed me, or at least the version of our relationship I'd constructed in my head needed me, desperately, financially, emotionally, and there was something in that need that filled a space I hadn't realized was so completely empty until something started filling it. Questioning too hard risked losing that, and I understand now, looking back, that this reasoning is exactly the reasoning a good salesman spends a career learning to spot in other people. The buyer who wants the deal to close so badly he stops asking the questions that would kill it, who talks himself past a hesitation in a contractor's tone, because admitting the doubt would mean starting the whole search over again. I just never once turned that same scrutiny on myself. Not really. Not until a banking notification did it for me. The breaking point, when it finally came, arrived through the most ordinary channel imaginable, my own banking app, on an unremarkable Tuesday morning while I was drinking coffee in my kitchen in Denver, still in the sweatpants I'd slept in, no plan for the day beyond a doctor's appointment that afternoon. I'd set up a linked account for Joy's monthly allowance a while back, transfers going out on the first of every month, along with occasional additional transfers for whatever came up, a medical bill, a family need, small home repairs. I was reviewing the account that morning for entirely mundane reasons, reconciling it against my own retirement budget the way I did every few months, a habit left over from 31 years of tracking expense reports, when I noticed a transaction I hadn't made. Not money going out, money coming in. A remittance, $400, from a sender listed only by initials, JK, landing directly in the account I'd set up for her. I stared at that line item for a long time, long enough that my coffee went cold beside me. In 18 months of this relationship, money had only ever moved in one direction between us, out of my accounts and into hers, a flow so consistent I'd stopped even really registering it as a flow, more like weather, just the climate we lived in. A payment coming in from someone else broke that pattern so completely that my first instinct, genuinely, was that it must be some kind of banking error, a misdirected transfer meant for a different account entirely, and I actually spent 20 minutes composing an email to the bank's fraud department before I stopped myself and called Joy instead. I called her that evening, keeping my voice light, mentioning it almost as a curiosity rather than a confrontation, asking if she knew anything about a $400 deposit from someone with the initials JK. She went quiet on the other end of the line for a beat longer than felt natural, then said, "Oh, that's nothing. Probably a mistake from the bank. I'll check tomorrow." I told her that sounded reasonable. I didn't believe it. Not fully, not even in the moment, but I let the conversation move on to something else. The way you let a customer's weak explanation slide when you're not yet ready to lose the sale. And we talked for another 20 minutes about her sister's upcoming exams before saying goodnight. I didn't let it go though, not really. And that night, after Joy had signed off the call, I did something I'd never once done in 18 months together. I logged into the shared cloud backup on the tablet I'd bought her, one I still had access credentials for, from when I'd set it up myself, more out of a vague, uneasy curiosity than any clear plan of what I was looking for. What I found, over the following 2 hours, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a coffee gone cold beside me, dismantled 18 months of my life in a way I still haven't fully finished processing. There was Min Jun, from Seoul, messages going back over a year, warm, intimate messages that used phrases I recognized immediately because I'd received near-identical ones myself, the same endearments, the same references to a difficult childhood and a mother who needed support, told with almost word-for-word phrasing to a different man in a different country, down to the detail about the shoes 2 sizes too small, that I'd thought, until that night, belonged only to me. There was a man in Melbourne, Australian by the sound of his messages, casual and easy in his tone, sending photos of a house he was apparently renovating with what he called our future place. Another in Osaka whose messages were mostly in halting English, mixed with what I assumed was translated Japanese, careful and formal in a way that suggested real effort on his part. And a fourth in Dubai, an engineer by the sound of his profile, who'd apparently been sending money for over 2 years, longer than I'd even known joy existed, his messages the most frequent of all 4, sometimes 3 or 4 a day, each one answered promptly, warmly, on schedule. What broke something loose in me more than the money, more even than the betrayal itself, was the calendar. A simple color-coded scheduling app on the tablet, entries in blue, green, orange, and purple, each color corresponding, I worked out fairly quickly, to a different man. Video call windows staggered carefully across different time zones. Seoul in the early morning her time, Melbourne mid-afternoon, Osaka evening, Dubai late at night, after I'd normally have already signed off for the day myself. Each entry had small notes attached, reminders really, a birthday, an anniversary of when they'd first met, a recent complaint or worry the man had mentioned that needed following up on, the kind of careful customer relationship management I'd have praised without hesitation in any of the junior sales reps I'd trained over the decades, had it been applied to selling equipment instead of selling herself into 5 separate lives at once. My own calls, I realized with a specific, sick kind of clarity, had a color too, red, scheduled with the same careful precision as the others, slotted into a system that treated me not as a relationship, but as an account, to be managed alongside 4 other accounts, each one generating its own steady, reliable revenue. I sat with that tablet for the rest of the night, working through message after message, watching a pattern emerge that I recognized, with a horrible kind of professional respect, as genuinely sophisticated relationship management, the exact skill set I'd spent 31 years building in a completely different industry. Each man had his own emotional narrative, tailored slightly to what seemed to work on him specifically, but built from the same underlying architecture, the difficult childhood, the family in need, the sense that he alone had been chosen, he alone had rescued her, he alone mattered in a way none of the others did. It was, I understood somewhere around 3 in the morning, not a woman who'd stumbled into infidelity out of loneliness or opportunity. It was a small business, expertly run, that had simply changed its physical location from a bar on Fields Avenue to a sofa in an apartment I was personally paying for, using a phone I had personally purchased. I went back through that folder labeled Our Life, the night I found the tablet, scrolling through months of photos with a very different eye than the one I'd used the first time around, and I noticed things I hadn't let myself notice before. The way her smile, in some of the market photos, looked slightly different from the smile she gave me directly, more relaxed somehow, less aimed at anyone in particular, a detail that meant nothing on its own, but that sat differently once stacked alongside everything else I'd learned that night. I didn't delete the folder. I still have it actually, saved on an external drive now rather than my phone. Not out of sentimentality exactly, more out of some stubborn insistence on remembering accurately, rather than either romanticizing or demonizing the whole thing after the fact. And I want to say I confronted her calmly, the way I'd have handled a difficult negotiation across a boardroom table. But the truth is my voice shook more than I'd have liked admitting to at the time. I told her what I'd found, laid it out plainly. Minjun, Melbourne, Osaka, Dubai, the color-coded calendar, all of it, reading off names and dates from the notes I'd scrawled the night before, like I was presenting evidence in a courtroom, rather than talking to a woman I'd been building a life with. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I genuinely didn't know whether the call had dropped, and then she said something I've turned over more times than almost anything else in this whole story. Terrence, I never lied about loving you. I just never stopped needing the others too. You don't understand what it's like to feel safe only when there's more than one door open. I asked her, my voice barely holding together, whether leaving the bar had ever meant anything at all, whether the graduation I thought I'd watched had been real in any sense whatsoever, whether baby's little ledger and the send-off party and the girls hugging her goodbye at the entrance had all just been theater staged for my benefit, a performance I'd paid $3,000 to watch, without ever once suspecting it was a performance at all. The bar was never the thing you were paying me to leave, she said, her voice steady in a way that somehow hurt more than if she'd cried. The bar was just where you found me. What I do didn't change, only the room did. I asked her, because I needed to hear the answer even though some part of me already knew it, whether any of the 4 other men knew about me, the way I now knew about them, my voice barely above a whisper by that point in the call. No, she said, simply, no hesitation at all, the answer arriving faster than any other answer she'd given me that entire call. Nobody knows about anybody. That's the whole point, Terrence. I remember that sentence landing somewhere I still haven't fully recovered from, the casual, almost professional clarity of it, spoken by a woman explaining her business model, rather than confessing a betrayal. I didn't say much after that. I remember sitting with the phone still against my ear for a long time after she'd stopped talking, staring at a wall in my Denver kitchen, doing the kind of quiet, devastated math I'd once have done on a lost account, tallying up 18 months, the bar debt, the send-off money, the apartment, the furniture, the monthly allowance, the medical bills for a mother I now had real reason to doubt I'd ever accurately understood, coming to a total somewhere north of $60,000, money I'd handed over believing, with total sincerity, that I was funding a rescue rather than staffing a franchise location. I flew out one more time after that, not to salvage anything, I want to be clear about that, but because some part of me needed to see the apartment one last time, needed to stand in that space and understand, physically, what I'd actually built. The flight felt longer than any of the previous ones had, though the route hadn't changed at all, and I remember sitting in the terminal in Denver beforehand, rehearsing what I might say, the way I used to rehearse a closing pitch, and arriving with none of it feeling remotely usable once I actually stood in front of her. Joy wasn't defensive when I arrived, which somehow made it worse rather than better. She was almost businesslike, the same clinical efficiency I remembered from baby negotiating her exit fee all those months earlier, as if she understood exactly what was ending, and had already, on some level, moved on to whatever came next. She'd made coffee, the same way she always had, and we sat at the small kitchen table where I'd once helped her practice English phrases for a job interview she never actually needed to have. "I'm sorry it hurt you," she said, sitting on the sofa where I now understood 4 other relationships had also, at various staggered hours, been conducted, her voice gentle in a way that felt, even then, genuinely kind rather than performed. "But I never asked you to believe it was only me and you. You decided that part yourself." I told her that was probably the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. She didn't argue with that either, just nodded slowly, looking down at her own hands for a long moment, before looking back up at me. I asked her, before I left that apartment for the last time, what she planned to do now that I knew, whether Min-jun and the others would simply absorb the gap I'd leave behind, whether there'd be a 5th color added to that calendar within the month, replacing red with something new, before the apartment even had time to feel my absence. She didn't answer directly, just said, quietly, "I'll be okay, Terrence. I'm always okay." I believed her completely, which was its own particular kind of devastating thing to sit with on the long flight home. I called Roland that same evening, sitting in a hotel room, rather than the apartment for the first time in over a year, and told him everything, the whole thing, start to finish. He didn't say "I told you so," which I appreciated more than I could have told him at the time. He just listened, quiet on the other end of the line except for the occasional low whistle at certain details, the calendar especially, and when I finished he said, quietly, "Terrence, you didn't do anything a good man wouldn't have done. You just did it for someone who was better at this than either of us understood." I asked him what he meant by better. He said, 6 years in that industry, Terrence. That's not a woman who fell into something. That's a woman who mastered a trade. You'd have hired her yourself, back in the day, if she'd been selling equipment instead of everything else. I didn't have anything to say back to that, but I've thought about it often since. The strange, uncomfortable respect buried inside his observation. The recognition of skill, even in the middle of genuine heartbreak. I flew home a final time about a week later, and the weeks that followed felt less like grief in the shape I recognized from my divorce, and more like a kind of professional humiliation layered on top of a real emotional wound, the specific shame of a man who'd spent his whole career reading buyers, and had somehow never once turned that same scrutiny on the person managing him. I told Melissa the full story on a video call. All of it. No editing this time. Sitting on my back porch in the fading evening light, while she listened from her own kitchen, 2 states away, her husband occasionally passing behind her in the frame, glancing at the screen with a concerned expression, before quietly moving on. She cried a little, not out of judgment, I understood watching her face, but out of relief that I'd finally told her the truth, after so many months of the careful, incomplete version I'd been feeding her. A version that had, I realized only then, been protecting her from worry, at the cost of protecting myself from the truth. "Dad, I wasn't worried you'd get your heart broken," she said, wiping her eyes but keeping her voice steady. "I was worried you'd never let yourself see it happening. This is actually better. You saw it." I hadn't thought about it that way before she said it, but she was right, in her own way. Seeing it, however late, however expensive, was still better than the alternative, the version of this story where I never checked that banking app, never noticed the reverse transaction, and simply kept funding a business I didn't know I was co-owner of, indefinitely, without ever once understanding my actual role in it. I don't hate joy, and I've had to sit with that for a long time to understand why. Because on paper, hatred would be the simpler, more comfortable response. What I've come to believe, turning this whole thing over across months of long Denver evenings, is that joy built the only kind of security available to a woman who'd learned, from the age of 19 onward, that any single man's affection could disappear without warning, and that real safety meant never depending entirely on one door staying open. I don't think that makes what she did to me acceptable. I paid real money, felt real love, and got managed rather than met in return. And that's a genuine betrayal regardless of the survival logic underneath it. The same way a con artist's difficult childhood doesn't refund the victim's savings account, however much it might explain the choices that led there. But I've stopped needing her to be simply cruel in order for my own grief to make sense, the same way I've stopped needing myself to be simply foolish. I was a lonely man who wanted a rescue story badly enough to fund one myself, and she was a woman who'd learned, the hard way, long before I ever walked into that bar, that rescue stories are safest when you're running 4 of them at once. I still live in Denver, still see Roland every few months when he flies back for a visit, always with some updated story about a fresh American retiree, fresh off the plane, and full of the same certainty I once carried myself. And I've started dating again. Carefully, slowly, nothing serious yet. Though Melissa keeps sending me profiles of what she calls normal Denver women my own age, with a persistence I find more endearing than annoying these days, occasionally forwarding one with a note that just says, "No bar required, Dad," which makes me laugh every single time, even though it also still stings a little. I think about that banking app notification more than almost anything else from those 18 months. The strange, almost accidental way the truth arrived. Not through a confession or a confrontation, but through a single reverse transaction that broke a pattern I'd stopped even noticing was a pattern at all. I've come to believe that's usually how the truth actually arrives in situations like this. Not through some dramatic reveal, but through one small inconsistency in a system otherwise built to run smoothly. A system I helped fund without ever once asking who else might be paying into the same account. I sold industrial equipment for 31 years without ever once getting fooled by a client's story, and it took a woman a fraction of my age, working an entirely different trade, to teach me that the same discipline I applied every single day at the office had somehow never once made it home with me, into the one relationship where I needed it most.